The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square as Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the balcony of the Apostolic Palace. It was October 15, 2023, and thousands of faithful had gathered for the weekly papal audience. The 78-year-old pontiff moved slowly but purposefully, his white robes flowing in the gentle Roman breeze. Pope Leo XIV, born Cardinal Alessandro Marchetti in Milan, had been elected to the papacy just 18 months earlier. Unlike his predecessors, he had made it clear from the beginning that his papacy would be different. He refused the traditional papal limousine, often walked among the crowds without heavy security, and insisted on maintaining direct contact with ordinary people. As he began his address to the gathered crowd, speaking in his warm, accented English, Pope Leo XIV noticed something unusual in the sea of faces below. Near the front of the square, a small family caught his attention. A man and woman stood holding the hands of a young girl who appeared to be about 8 years old. Even from his elevated position, the Pope could see that something was wrong with the child. The little girl, later identified as Maria Santos from Brazil, was clearly struggling. Her parents, Carlos and Elena Santos, had spent their life savings to bring their daughter to Rome. Maria had been diagnosed with a rare form of childhood leukemia 6 months earlier. The doctors in Sao Paulo had given her only weeks to live, but the Santos family refused to give up hope. Elena Santos had been praying to Pope Leo XIV since his election, believing that his reputation for miracles might somehow help her dying daughter. The family had sold everything they owned, borrowed money from relatives, and made the exhausting journey from Brazil to Italy with one desperate hope, that somehow, someway, the Pope might notice their suffering child. As Pope Leo XIV continued his address, he found himself unable to concentrate on his prepared remarks. His eyes kept returning to the small girl in the crowd. She was leaning heavily against her mother, her pale face turned upward toward the papal balcony. Something deep within the Pope's heart stirred, a feeling he had experienced only a few times in his long religious career. The Pope's security detail had strict protocols. No unscheduled interactions with the crowd. No deviation from planned routes. No spontaneous decisions that could compromise the papal safety. But Pope Leo XIV had never been one to follow rules when human suffering was involved. Without warning, he stepped away from the microphone. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertoli, his closest advisor, immediately moved toward him with concern. "Your Holiness, the address is not finished," the cardinal whispered urgently. Pope Leo XIV placed a gentle hand on Cardinal Bertoli's shoulder. "Giuseppe, sometimes God calls us to abandon our plans," he said quietly. "I see a child who needs help." The crowd of nearly 50,000 people watched in confusion as their Pope suddenly left the balcony mid-speech. Social media immediately exploded with speculation. Had the Pope fallen ill? Was there some kind of emergency? Vatican photographers and television crews scrambled to follow what was happening. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo XIV moved with surprising speed for a man his age. His white robes billowed behind him as he practically ran through the ornate hallways, followed by a growing entourage of concerned Vatican officials and security personnel. "Your Holiness, please," pleaded Monsignor Antonio Valdez, the papal protocol officer. "We must follow proper procedures. If you wish to meet with visitors, we can arrange." "No arrangements," Pope Leo XIV said firmly, not breaking his stride. "That child cannot wait for our bureaucracy." The Pope's sudden departure from protocol sent shockwaves through the Vatican hierarchy. Pope Leo XIV had always been considered somewhat unconventional, but this level of spontaneous action was unprecedented. Cardinal Secretary of State Marco Torretti was immediately contacted and rushed to intervene. Meanwhile, in St. Peter's Square, the Santos family had no idea what was happening. They had watched the Pope disappear from the balcony and assumed the audience was over. Carlos Santos was preparing to leave, disappointed that their long journey seemed to have been for nothing. Little Maria was growing weaker by the minute. The long trip from Brazil, combined with her deteriorating condition, had left her barely able to stand. Elena Santos held her daughter close, whispering prayers in Portuguese while tears streamed down her face. "Mommy, I want to go home," Maria whispered in her native language. Her voice was so weak that her mother had to lean down to hear her. "Just a little longer, minha filha," Elena replied, stroking her daughter's thin hair. "Just a little longer." The crowd in St. Peter's Square was beginning to disperse when something extraordinary happened. The massive doors of St. Peter's Basilica suddenly swung open, and Pope Leo XIV emerged, walking quickly across the square directly toward the crowd. The Vatican Swiss Guard immediately formed a protective formation around the Pope, but he waved them back. "Give me space," he commanded in Italian. "I need to reach someone." Security personnel spoke rapidly into their radios, calling for backup and crowd control. This was exactly the kind of situation they had been trained to prevent. An unscheduled papal walkabout with thousands of people present was a security nightmare. But Pope Leo XIV seemed oblivious to the chaos he was creating. His eyes were fixed on one target, the small family near the front of the square. He moved through the crowd with determination, blessing people as he passed but never stopping his forward progress. Carlos Santos was the first to notice the Pope approaching. He grabbed his wife's arm and pointed in disbelief. "Elena! Elena, look!" Elena Santos turned and gasped. The Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, was walking directly toward them. She immediately fell to her knees, pulling Maria down with her. Pope Leo XIV reached the Santos family within minutes, despite the growing crowd of people trying to get his attention. He knelt down on the ancient stones of St. Peter's Square, bringing himself to eye level with little Maria. "Hello, my child," he said softly in accented English, then switched to Spanish, which the family could better understand. "Como te llamas?" Maria looked up at the Pope with wide, tired eyes. Despite her illness, she recognized the importance of the moment. "Maria," she whispered. "A beautiful name," Pope Leo XIV said, reaching out to gently touch the child's face. "The name of our Blessed Mother." Elena Santos was sobbing now, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was happening. "Holy Father," she managed to say in broken English, "my daughter, she is very sick." Pope Leo XIV nodded solemnly. He had seen many sick children during his long career in the church, but something about Maria's condition seemed to call out to him on a deeper level. He could sense the desperation in her parents, the love that had driven them thousands of miles seeking a miracle. The Pope's security team was growing increasingly nervous. Crowds were pressing closer, cell phone cameras were capturing every moment, and the situation was spiraling beyond their control. Captain Heinrich Müller, head of the Swiss Guard, approached cautiously. "Your Holiness," he said in hushed tones, "we really must return to the palace. This crowd is becoming unmanageable." Pope Leo XIV looked up at Captain Müller with eyes that seemed to burn within her fire. "Captain, how long have you served the church?" 15 years, Your Holiness." "In those 15 years, have you ever seen Christ turn away a sick child because of security concerns?" Captain Müller had no answer. He stepped back, allowing the Pope to continue his interaction with the Santos family. Pope Leo XIV turned his attention back to Maria, who was now sitting on the ground, too weak to stand. Her breathing was labored, and her skin had a grayish pallor that indicated her condition was critical. "Maria," the Pope said gently, "I want you to know that you are loved. Not just by your beautiful parents, but by God Himself." "Do you believe that?" The little girl nodded weakly. "See, Papa Francisco," she said, confusing him with his predecessor. Pope Leo XIV smiled. "Close enough, my dear child. Close enough." What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years to come. Pope Leo XIV placed both of his hands on Maria's head and closed his eyes. The crowd around them gradually fell silent as people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The Pope began to pray, not in Latin as might be expected, but in Italian, then Spanish, and, finally, in a language that none of the gathered crowd recognized. His voice grew stronger and more passionate as he continued, and witnesses later reported that they felt a strange energy emanating from where he knelt. For several minutes, Pope Leo XIV remained motionless, his hands on Maria's head, his lips moving in silent prayer. The entire square had fallen completely quiet. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Elena Santos watched her daughter's face during this prayer, and later told reporters that she saw something she had never seen in the 6 months since Maria's diagnosis, color returning to her cheeks. When Pope Leo XIV finally opened his eyes and removed his hands, he looked directly at Maria's parents. "Have faith," he said simply. "God's will be done." The Pope stood slowly, his knees protesting after kneeling on the hard stone for so long. He blessed the Santos family one final time, then turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "My brothers and sisters," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "today we have been reminded that love is the most powerful force in the universe. This family has traveled across the world seeking hope, and we must never turn away from those who seek hope in God's name. As Pope Leo XIV began walking back toward the basilica, something remarkable happened. Maria Santos, who had been unable to stand for the past hour, suddenly sat up straighter. Her breathing seemed easier, and the color in her face continued to improve. "Mommy," she said to her mother, her voice stronger than it had been in days, "I feel different." Elena Santos looked at her daughter in amazement. While she didn't dare to hope for too much, she could see that Maria did indeed look better than she had in months. The crowd began to disperse, but word of what had happened spread quickly throughout Rome and, then, around the world. Social media posts showing Pope Leo XIV kneeling with the sick child went viral within hours. News crews that had been present for the routine papal audience suddenly found themselves covering what many were already calling a miracle. Carlos Santos carefully helped his wife and daughter to their feet. For the first time in months, Maria was able to walk without assistance, though they moved slowly and cautiously. "What do we do now?" Carlos asked his wife in Portuguese. Elena looked back toward the basilica where Pope Leo XIV had disappeared. "We have faith," she said, echoing the Pope's words. "And we see what tomorrow brings." As the Santos family made their way out of St. Peter's Square, none of them could have imagined how dramatically their lives were about to change, or how the Pope's simple act of compassion would send shockwaves around the entire world. The Vatican's official response to the day's events was carefully measured. Cardinal Bertoli issued a statement that evening acknowledging the Pope's interaction with the Santos family and asking for privacy for all involved while the situation develops. But, behind the closed doors of the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo XIV was facing intense pressure from Vatican officials who believed his spontaneous actions had created a crisis. Cardinal Torretti was particularly vocal in his concerns. "Your Holiness," he said during an emergency meeting that evening, "we cannot have the Pope walking unscheduled into crowds." "The security implications alone." Marco, Pope Leo XIV interrupted, using the Cardinal's first name rather than his title. "When did we become more concerned with security than with souls?" It was a question that would define everything that happened next, as the Pope's simple act of compassion began to spiral into consequences that no one could have predicted. The news of Pope Leo XIV's encounter with Maria Santos spread across the globe like wildfire. Within 12 hours, the video footage captured by tourists and news crews had been viewed over 10 million times on social media platforms. Major news networks from CNN to the BBC were running continuous coverage of what they were calling the miracle in St. Peter's Square. Dr. Luisa Rodriguez, the pediatric oncologist who had been treating Maria in Sao Paulo, received an urgent phone call at 3 a.m. local time from a colleague in Rome. "Luisa, you need to see the news. Your patient, the Santos girl, she's all over the internet." Dr. Rodriguez rushed to her computer and watched the footage in disbelief. She had examined Maria Santos just 1 week before the family left for Rome, and the child had been in the final stages of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Her white blood cell count was critically high, her organs were beginning to fail, and Dr. Rodriguez had privately given her only days to live. Yet here was Maria, walking and talking in St. Peter's Square after an encounter with the Pope. Dr. Rodriguez immediately called the hospital and demanded that Maria's complete medical file be prepared for immediate transmission to Rome. "Doctor," asked her assistant, "do you think it's really possible? Could the Pope have cured her?" Dr. Rodriguez, a woman of science who had spent 20 years treating cancer patients, struggled with her answer. "I've seen spontaneous remissions before," she said carefully. "But nothing like this. If Maria is truly improving, we need to document everything." In Rome, the Santos family had returned to their modest hotel near the Vatican, completely unaware of the global attention their daughter's story was receiving. They had no internet access and spoke limited English, so they had no idea that their faces were being broadcast around the world. Carlos Santos sat on the edge of the hotel bed, watching his daughter play with a small doll her mother had brought from Brazil. For the first time in months, Maria was sitting up without assistance, and her appetite had returned. She had eaten a full dinner the night before and had slept peacefully through the night. "Elena," Carlos said quietly to his wife, "I'm afraid to hope." Elena Santos understood her husband's caution. They had hoped before, when the doctors in Brazil had tried experimental treatments. They had hoped when Maria seemed to respond briefly to chemotherapy. Each time, their hopes had been crushed when her condition worsened. "But, look at her," Elena whispered, gesturing toward their daughter. "When was the last time you saw her play like this?" It was true. Maria was humming softly to herself as she combed her doll's hair, something she hadn't had the energy to do in weeks. Her breathing was steady and unlabored, and the terrible pallor that had frightened her parents for months was gone. A knock at their hotel room door interrupted their quiet conversation. Carlos opened it to find Father Miguel Hernandez, a Spanish priest who served as a translator for Vatican visitors from Latin America. "Señor and Señora Santos," Father Hernandez said in fluent Spanish, "I apologize for the early hour, but the Vatican has asked me to speak with you urgently." Elena immediately panicked. "Are we in trouble? Did we do something wrong yesterday?" Father Hernandez smiled reassuringly. No, you've done nothing wrong. But your daughter's encounter with the Holy Father has attracted significant attention, and the Vatican believes it would be best if Maria could be examined by doctors here in Rome." Carlos looked suspicious. "Why? She seems much better." "That's exactly why," Father Hernandez explained. "If God has indeed worked through His Holiness to help your daughter, the Church has a responsibility to document what has happened. There are procedures for investigating potential miracles." The word miracle hung in the air. Elena Santos felt her knees grow weak. In her heart, she had believed from the moment the Pope touched her daughter that something extraordinary had occurred, but hearing an official representative of the Vatican use that word made it seem suddenly real. "What would this examination involve?" she asked. "Dr. Alessandro Toriani, one of Rome's most respected pediatric specialists, has volunteered to examine Maria at no cost to your family. He works at Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital, which is actually owned by the Vatican. If you agree, we could arrange for Maria to be seen this afternoon." Carlos and Elena looked at each other, then at their daughter, who was still playing contentedly on the bed. After the months of medical procedures and hospital visits, the thought of more doctors was overwhelming. But they also knew they needed to understand what was happening to their child. "We'll do it," Carlos said finally. "But we want to stay with Maria through everything." Of course, Father Hernandez agreed. The Vatican has also arranged for accommodations at Casa Santa Marta, where visiting dignitaries stay. You'll be much more comfortable there, and it will provide privacy from the media attention that is developing. Media attention was indeed developing rapidly. By noon Roman time, over 200 journalists from around the world had gathered in St. Peter's Square, hoping to catch another glimpse of the Santos family or to secure an interview with them. Rebecca Morrison, a reporter for the International Catholic News Service, had been covering Vatican affairs for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like the global interest in this story. Her editor in London had called her at dawn demanding continuous coverage. "This could be the story of the century," her editor had said. "A papal healing caught on video in the age of social media. Religious leaders around the world are already commenting." Indeed, reaction from religious communities had been swift and varied. Cardinal Joseph Brennan of Boston issued a statement calling for careful investigation and prayerful discernment. The Archbishop of Canterbury expressed his joy at any sign of God's healing power. However, some evangelical leaders questioned whether Catholics were being too quick to claim divine intervention. Dr. Robert Harrison, a prominent skeptic and member of the International Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, appeared on CNN that morning to offer a different perspective. "We need to be very careful here," Dr. Harrison warned. Spontaneous remission of cancer, while rare, is a documented medical phenomenon. Without complete medical records and proper testing, it's irresponsible to claim this is anything supernatural. His comments were immediately criticized by believers, but they highlighted the intense scrutiny that the Santos case would face from both scientific and religious communities. Meanwhile, Dr. Alessandro Toriani was preparing for what might be the most important examination of his 30-year medical career. The Vatican had contacted him personally, explaining the situation and requesting his expertise. As a devout Catholic and respected pediatric oncologist, Dr. Toriani understood the gravity of what he was being asked to do. "If this child has been miraculously healed," he told his wife over lunch, "it will change everything we understand about medicine and faith. If she hasn't, and this is just a temporary improvement, then we must be honest about that as well." Dr. Toriani spent the afternoon reviewing the medical records that had been transmitted from Brazil. Dr. Rodriguez's documentation was thorough and troubling. Maria Santos had been dying, there was no question about that. Her most recent blood work showed blast cell counts that were incompatible with survival. At 4 p.m., the Santos family arrived at Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital in a Vatican car with tinted windows. They had been driven through a back entrance to avoid the growing crowd of media and curious onlookers that had gathered at the main hospital entrance. Maria Santos walked into the hospital holding both of her parents' hands, chatting excitedly in Portuguese about the pretty building and asking if she would see the Pope again. For a child who had been near death just days earlier, her energy and curiosity were remarkable. Dr. Torriani met them personally in a private examination room that had been prepared specifically for this case. He had arranged for the hospital's most advanced diagnostic equipment to be available, as well as a team of specialists in various fields related to childhood leukemia. Maria, Dr. Torriani said in Spanish, kneeling down to the child's level, "I'm going to examine you to make sure you're healthy. Is that okay?" Maria nodded enthusiastically. Unlike her previous medical encounters, which had been painful and frightening, this examination felt different to her. She wasn't sick anymore, so the doctors didn't scare her. The physical examination began with basic vital signs. Maria's temperature was normal, her blood pressure was within healthy ranges, and her heart rate was steady and strong. Dr. Torriani palpated her lymph nodes, which had been severely swollen just a week earlier according to the Brazilian medical records. "This is impossible," Dr. Torriani murmured to himself as he felt Maria's neck and underarms. The lymph nodes were completely normal in size and texture. He checked her liver and spleen, both of which had been enlarged due to the leukemia's progression. Again, everything felt completely normal. Dr. Torriani had examined hundreds of children with leukemia, and he had never encountered anything like this. "We'll need to do some blood work," he explained to Maria's parents. "Just a small sample to check her blood counts." The blood was drawn and rushed to the hospital's laboratory with instructions for immediate analysis. Dr. Torriani had requested a complete blood count with differential, comprehensive metabolic panel, and specific tests for leukemia markers. While they waited for the results, Dr. Torriani conducted additional tests. A chest X-ray showed no signs of the infections that had been plaguing Maria in Brazil. An echocardiogram revealed perfect heart function, despite the cardiac stress that her previous treatments had caused. After 2 hours of testing, Dr. Torriani sat down with the Santos family to discuss the preliminary results. He had practiced this conversation in his mind, but he still struggled to find the right words. "Senor and Senora Santos," he began carefully, "I want you to understand that these are preliminary results, and we will need to repeat some tests to be completely certain." Elena Santos gripped her husband's hand tightly. "Just tell us, doctor. Is our daughter going to be okay?" Dr. Torriani looked at Maria, who was coloring in a book the nurses had given her, completely unaware of the momentous conversation happening around her. "Based on everything I've seen today," he said slowly, "your daughter shows no signs of leukemia. Her blood counts are completely normal. Her organs are functioning perfectly. By every measure we have, Maria appears to be a healthy 8-year-old girl." The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos Santos was the first to speak. "But that's not possible," he said. "She was dying. The doctors in Brazil said she had days to live." "I know," Dr. Torriani replied. "I've reviewed all of her medical records from Sao Paulo. Dr. Rodriguez documented advanced stage acute lymphoblastic leukemia with multiple organ involvement. The disease was progressing rapidly and not responding to treatment." "So what are you saying?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Torriani chose his words carefully. As a man of science and faith, he understood the implications of what he was about to say. "I'm saying that, medically speaking, what has happened to your daughter is beyond our current understanding of how cancer works. In my professional opinion, this appears to be what we would call a complete and instantaneous remission." Elena Santos began to cry, but they were tears of joy and overwhelming relief. Carlos Santos sat in stunned silence, trying to process what the doctor had told them. "Doctor," Elena asked through her tears, "do you think the Pope really healed our daughter?" Dr. Torriani looked at the little girl who was humming softly while she colored, completely healthy and happy. He thought about his 30 years of medical training, his understanding of cancer progression, and the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "Senora Santos," he said finally, "I believe that something extraordinary happened to your daughter in St. Peter's Square yesterday." Whether that was divine intervention or some medical phenomenon we don't yet understand, I cannot say with certainty. But I can say this: your daughter is healthy, and that is nothing short of miraculous. As word of Dr. Torriani's preliminary findings began to leak from the hospital, the world's attention on the Santos case intensified dramatically. Religious believers saw it as confirmation of God's power working through Pope Leo XIV. Scientists demanded more testing and documentation. Skeptics questioned the validity of the Brazilian medical records. But, in the quiet hospital room, none of that mattered to Carlos and Elena Santos. Their daughter was healthy, and, for the first time in months, they allowed themselves to truly hope for the future. What they didn't know was that their story was about to become the center of a global controversy that would challenge both medical science and religious faith, forcing the world to confront questions about the nature of miracles in the modern age. News of Dr. Torriani's preliminary findings reached the Vatican within hours, creating an unprecedented crisis in the papal apartments. Cardinal Secretary of State Marco Torretti burst into Pope Leo XIV's private study without the usual formal announcements, clutching a folder of medical reports. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Torretti said breathlessly, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention." Pope Leo XIV looked up from his evening prayers, noting the unusual urgency in his secretary's voice. "What troubles you, Marco?" "The Santos child, Your Holiness. Dr. Torriani's initial examination suggests that her cancer is completely gone. The media is calling it a miracle, and the story is spreading faster than we can control it." Pope Leo XIV closed his prayer book and gave Cardinal Torretti his full attention. In the 18 months since his election, he had faced many challenges, but none quite like this. "And what does Dr. Torriani actually say about the child's condition?" the Pope asked calmly. Cardinal Torretti opened his folder and read from the preliminary report. "Complete remission of all cancer markers. Normal blood counts. No sign of organ damage from the disease. He says it's medically inexplicable based on the Brazilian medical records." The Pope was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. He remembered the moment in St. Peter's Square when he had felt compelled to approach the Santos family, the strange energy he had sensed while praying over Maria, and the feeling that something greater than himself was working through his actions. "Have we verified the authenticity of the Brazilian medical records?" Pope Leo XIV asked. "Dr. Rodriguez from Sao Paulo is flying to Rome tonight with the complete original files. She wants to examine Maria herself. The Vatican has also requested an independent review by specialists from Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic." The implications of the situation were staggering. If Maria Santos had indeed been miraculously healed through the Pope's intervention, it would be the most documented miracle in modern history. The Catholic Church had strict protocols for investigating miracles, usually taking years or decades to reach conclusions. But this case was unfolding in real time under global media scrutiny. "What is the Church's official position?" Pope Leo XIV asked. Cardinal Torretti shifted uncomfortably. "The Congregation for the Causes of Saints is in emergency session. Cardinal Benedetti wants to issue a statement calling for patience and proper investigation. However, Catholic communities worldwide are already celebrating what they believe is a divine healing. Indeed, the reaction from Catholics around the world had been overwhelming. Churches from Manila to Mexico City had held special prayer services thanking God for the apparent miracle. Sales of Pope Leo XIV prayer cards and religious medals had skyrocketed. The Vatican's phone lines and email servers were overloaded with messages from the faithful seeking blessings and healing. But the reaction from the scientific community was very different. Dr. Stephen Patterson, chief of oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, had appeared on multiple news programs questioning the validity of the claim. "Cancer doesn't just disappear overnight," Dr. Patterson had told NBC News. "Even in cases of spontaneous remission, the process takes weeks or months, not hours. We need to see complete medical documentation before anyone jumps to supernatural conclusions." His skepticism was shared by many in the medical establishment, creating a sharp divide between religious believers who saw divine intervention and scientists who demanded empirical evidence. Dr. Luisa Rodriguez landed at Rome's Fiumicino Airport at 10:30 p.m., carrying with her Maria Santos's complete medical file dating back to the initial diagnosis. She had not slept since receiving the call about Maria's apparent recovery, and her mind raced with questions about what she might find. As the pediatric oncologist who had overseen Maria's care for 6 months, Dr. Rodriguez knew the child's case intimately. She had watched the aggressive cancer spread throughout Maria's small body despite every treatment available. The last bone marrow biopsy had shown blast cells comprising over 90% of Maria's white blood cell count. "It's impossible," she muttered to herself as her taxi navigated through Rome's evening traffic. Leukemia doesn't just vanish. At the same time, in the Casa Santa Marta guest quarters where the Santos family was now staying, Maria was experiencing what could only be described as the best night of her life. She had eaten a full meal for the first time in months, played games with her parents, and was now sleeping peacefully in a comfortable bed. Elena Santos sat in a chair beside her daughter's bed, watching Maria sleep. The child's breathing was deep and regular, her color was healthy and pink, and she had smiled more today than in all the previous months combined. "Carlos," Elena whispered to her husband, "I keep waiting for her to wake up sick again." Carlos Santos understood his wife's fear. They had experienced false hopes before, brief periods where Maria seemed to improve before the cancer reasserted its grip on her small body. But this felt different. The change in their daughter was not just physical but spiritual. She seemed filled with a joy and energy that had been absent for so long. The doctor said her blood was completely normal, Carlos reminded his wife. Not just better, but normal. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV was struggling with his own doubts and questions. In the quiet of his private chapel, he knelt before a simple wooden crucifix and prayed for guidance. The weight of what might have happened through his actions was almost overwhelming. He remembered the moment in the square when he had felt an irresistible urge to approach the sick child. During his long career as a priest and bishop, he had prayed over many suffering people, but he had never experienced anything like the energy that had flowed through him while his hands rested on Maria's head. "Lord," he prayed aloud, "if you have worked through me to heal this child, help me to understand your purpose. If this is not your work, protect this family from false hope." His prayers were interrupted by a soft knock on the chapel door. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertoli, his most trusted advisor, entered quietly. "Holy Father, forgive the interruption, but there have been new developments." Pope Leo XIV rose from his knees and turned to face his old friend. "What news, Giuseppe?" "Dr. Rodriguez has arrived and is demanding to examine Maria immediately. She's quite agitated and claims there must be some mistake in the Roman test results. Also, we've received requests for comment from over 300 news organizations worldwide. The story has reached every major media outlet on the planet. The global attention was indeed unprecedented. CNN had assigned a team of reporters to cover the story around the clock. The BBC had interrupted regular programming to provide updates. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #MiracleInRome and #PopesHealing. Religious pilgrims were booking flights to Rome by the thousands, hoping to witness or experience similar healings. But, perhaps most significantly, other families with sick children had begun arriving in Rome, seeking audiences with Pope Leo XIV. The Vatican Security Office reported that over 50 families from various countries had gathered near St. Peter's Square, many carrying signs pleading for the Pope's healing touch. "This is becoming untenable," Cardinal Bertoli said. "We cannot have the Pope laying hands on every sick child in Europe. But, if we refuse these families after what appears to have happened with Maria Santos, we'll face enormous criticism." Pope Leo XIV understood the impossible position he was in. If Maria's healing was genuine divine intervention, how could he turn away other suffering families? But, if it was simply an extraordinary medical coincidence, raising false hopes in desperate parents would be cruel. Arrange for Dr. Rodriguez to examine Maria tomorrow morning, the Pope decided. Let her conduct whatever tests she feels are necessary. We need absolute certainty about what has happened before we can proceed. The next morning brought even more dramatic developments. Dr. Rodriguez arrived at Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital at 7 a.m., accompanied by 2 colleagues from Brazil and carrying additional medical equipment. Her plan was to conduct a comprehensive re-examination of Maria Santos and to verify the Roman test results. Maria greeted the Brazilian doctor with enthusiasm, recognizing her from the many appointments in Sao Paulo. Unlike their previous meetings, where Maria had been weak and frightened, today she was alert and energetic. "Dr. Rodriguez!" Maria exclaimed in Portuguese, running up to hug the oncologist. Dr. Rodriguez was immediately struck by the transformation in her young patient. The pale, listless child she had examined in Brazil was gone, replaced by a vibrant, healthy-looking girl. But her scientific training demanded skepticism. "Let's start with basic blood work," Dr. Rodriguez told her colleagues. "I want to personally observe every test." The blood draw proceeded smoothly, with Maria chatting cheerfully throughout the procedure. Dr. Rodriguez personally carried the samples to the laboratory and observed as the tests were run. She had brought her own equipment to verify the results independently. The initial results matched Dr. Toriani's findings exactly. Maria's white blood cell count was within normal ranges. More importantly, a flow cytometry analysis showed no detectable blast cells, the immature white blood cells that characterize leukemia. "Run it again," Dr. Rodriguez instructed the technician. "Check for any technical errors." The second round of tests produced identical results. Dr. Rodriguez stared at the computer printouts in disbelief. According to every measure available to medical science, Maria Santos no longer had cancer. Dr. Rodriguez then ordered a bone marrow biopsy, the most definitive test for leukemia. This was a painful procedure that required sedation, but it would provide absolute confirmation of Maria's status. The Santos parents agreed to the test, understanding its importance. While Maria was undergoing the biopsy, word leaked to the media that additional testing was taking place. The crowd of journalists outside the hospital swelled to over 500 people. News helicopters circled overhead, and police were called in to manage the growing chaos. Inside the hospital, Dr. Rodriguez examined the bone marrow sample under high-powered microscopy. What she saw defied everything she understood about cancer progression. The bone marrow was completely healthy, showing normal cell production with no signs of malignancy. "This is impossible," she said aloud, causing the laboratory technicians to gather around the microscope. "What do you see, doctor?" asked Dr. Toriani, who had arrived to observe the examination. Dr. Rodriguez stepped back from the microscope, her face pale with shock. "I see normal, healthy bone marrow. There is absolutely no evidence that this child has ever had leukemia." But Dr. Rodriguez knew that Maria had definitely had cancer. She had personally conducted multiple examinations, reviewed countless test results, and watched the disease progress despite aggressive treatment. The medical records she had brought from Brazil documented every stage of Maria's illness in meticulous detail. Could the Brazilian tests have been wrong? Dr. Toriani asked gently. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head emphatically. "I've triple-checked everything. The original diagnosis was confirmed by 3 independent laboratories. The progression was documented by CT scans, bone marrow biopsies, and blood work over 6 months. This child was dying from acute lymphoblastic leukemia 1 week ago." The 2 doctors stood in silence, contemplating the implications of what they had discovered. By every standard of medical science, what had happened to Maria Santos was impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. "So what do we tell the world?" Dr. Toriani asked. Dr. Rodriguez looked through the window at Maria, who was now awake from the sedation and playing with her parents. The child showed no ill effects from the invasive procedure and was asking when she could have lunch. "We tell them the truth," Dr. Rodriguez said finally. "We tell them that, medically speaking, Maria Santos has experienced something that challenges everything we understand about cancer and healing." As news of the latest test results began to circulate, the global reaction intensified dramatically. Religious leaders called it the greatest miracle of the modern era. Scientists demanded peer review and independent verification. Skeptics suggested elaborate hoaxes or misdiagnosis. But, in the quiet hospital room where Maria Santos was recovering from her tests, none of the global controversy mattered. A little girl who had been dying was now healthy, and her parents were experiencing a joy they had never dared to hope for. The question that remained was what Pope Leo XIV would do with the extraordinary gift he seemed to have been given, and how the world would respond to evidence that challenged the boundaries between faith and science in ways no one had ever imagined possible. The confirmation of Maria Santos's complete healing sent shockwaves around the globe that extended far beyond religious communities. Within 24 hours of Dr. Rodriguez's verification, the story had become the most covered news event of the year, surpassing political crises and natural disasters in media attention. Pope Leo XIV found himself at the center of a phenomenon he had never anticipated and wasn't sure he fully understood. As he sat in his private study reviewing reports from around the world, the magnitude of what had transpired was almost overwhelming. Cardinal Bertoli entered with the latest updates, his expression grave. Holy Father, we've received over 10,000 requests for healing appointments. Families are arriving in Rome from every continent. The hospitals here are offering to accommodate seriously ill patients free of charge, hoping for similar results. The Pope closed his eyes, feeling the weight of desperate hope from suffering families worldwide. He had prayed over many people during his long ministry, but never with such dramatic results. The question that tormented him was whether he possessed some genuine gift of healing or whether Maria's recovery was a singular miracle not meant to be repeated. What guidance are we receiving from the medical community? Pope Leo XIV asked. Mixed reactions, Your Holiness. Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Torriani have jointly published their findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. They've concluded that Maria's healing cannot be explained by current medical knowledge. However, they've also emphasized that this appears to be an isolated case. Indeed, the medical establishment was struggling to process what had happened. The joint report from the two oncologists had been peer-reviewed by experts from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the Mayo Clinic. Every reviewer had reached the same conclusion: based on documented evidence, Maria Santos had experienced what could only be called a medically impossible recovery. Dr. James Mitchell, director of the National Cancer Institute, had issued a statement that captured the scientific community's dilemma. While we cannot explain what happened to this child, we must be cautious about extrapolating from a single case to broader claims about faith healing. Science demands reproducible results. But reproducibility was exactly what hundreds of families now camping near the Vatican were hoping for. Among them was the Nakamura family from Japan, whose 12-year-old son Hiroshi was suffering from brain cancer. They had spent their savings to travel to Rome after seeing the news coverage. Keiko Nakamura, Hiroshi's mother, had set up a small tent in St. Peter's Square despite police efforts to maintain order. If the Pope can heal the Brazilian girl, she told reporters, maybe he can help my son too. Similar stories were emerging from the growing crowd. The O'Brien family from Ireland had brought their daughter with cystic fibrosis. The Petrov family from Russia had traveled with their son who had muscular dystrophy. Each family carried the same desperate hope that had driven the Santos family to Rome just days earlier. Pope Leo XIV knew he had to address this situation directly. The Vatican's usual measured approach to investigating miracles was impossible when the entire world was watching in real time. After consulting with his advisors, he made a decision that would define his papacy. I will meet with the families, he announced during an emergency Vatican meeting. But, we must be clear about expectations and honest about what we do and don't understand. Cardinal Torretti was horrified. Your Holiness, the security implications alone. Marco, if God has given me some role in healing, how can I hide behind security concerns? But, if what happened to Maria was a singular miracle, these families deserve to know that as well. Pope Leo XIV's decision to hold a special audience with the families of sick children was announced that afternoon. The Vatican made it clear that this would not be a healing service, but rather an opportunity for the Pope to pray with families and offer pastoral care during their suffering. The announcement triggered an unprecedented rush to Rome. Airlines reported a surge in bookings to Italy. Hotels near the Vatican were booked solid for months in advance. The Italian government deployed additional police and medical personnel to handle the influx of visitors. Maria Santos, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who met her. A week after her healing, she had gained weight, her energy levels were those of a normal 8-year-old, and repeated medical tests continued to show no trace of cancer. Her parents had decided to remain in Rome for additional monitoring, and Maria had become something of a celebrity among the Vatican staff. Papa Francisco, Maria said to Pope Leo XIV when he visited the Santos family at Casa Santa Marta, still confusing him with his predecessor, why are so many people sad here? The Pope knelt down to Maria's level, as he had in St. Peter's Square. They're not sad, my dear child. They're hoping. Just like your parents hoped when they brought you here. But, I feel better because God made me better, Maria said with the simple faith of a child. Can't God make them better too? It was a question that Pope Leo XIV had been asking himself constantly. If God had worked through him to heal Maria, surely the same power could help other suffering children. But, he also understood that God's will was often mysterious, and that not every prayer for healing was answered in the way people hoped. The special audience was scheduled for the following Sunday in St. Peter's Basilica. The Vatican had carefully screened the attending families to include only those with serious medical conditions, verified by documentation. Approximately 200 families from 43 countries would be present. As the day approached, global attention reached fever pitch. News crews from around the world set up permanent stations in Rome. The Pope's actions were being analyzed by theologians, scientists, and political leaders. The Vatican's website crashed multiple times from the volume of visitors seeking information. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist from Stanford University who specialized in the relationship between faith and healing, flew to Rome to observe the audience. From a scientific perspective, she told the Associated Press, this represents an unprecedented opportunity to study the intersection of belief, prayer, and physical healing under controlled conditions. The Vatican had arranged for medical personnel to be present during the audience, not because they expected mass healings, but to provide care for families dealing with seriously ill children. The emotional and physical stress of traveling with sick children had already resulted in several medical emergencies among the gathered families. On Sunday morning, Pope Leo XIV celebrated private mass in his chapel before the audience, praying for wisdom and discernment. He felt the weight of expectations from around the world, but also a deep sense of peace about whatever God intended to accomplish. Lord, he prayed, use me as you will, but help these families to find peace regardless of the outcome. At 10 a.m., the families began entering St. Peter's Basilica. The sight was both heartbreaking and beautiful, parents carrying children in wheelchairs, families holding hands as they walked slowly down the ancient aisles, the quiet murmur of prayers in dozens of languages. Maria Santos and her parents were given special seats near the front, and, when Maria saw the Pope enter, she waved enthusiastically and called out, Papa Francisco, causing a ripple of laughter and emotion throughout the basilica. Pope Leo XIV began with remarks that were broadcast live around the world. My dear brothers and sisters, he said, we gather today not because I have any special power, but because we believe in the power of God's love. What happened to young Maria may have been a singular miracle, or it may be part of God's larger plan for healing in our world. We do not know. But we know that every one of you is precious in God's sight. The Pope then did something unprecedented. Instead of conducting a formal service from the altar, he walked among the families, stopping to pray individually with each sick child. News cameras captured every moment as he knelt beside wheelchairs, held the hands of frightened children, and offered comfort to grieving parents. The Nakamura family was among the first he approached. 12-year-old Hiroshi, weakened by chemotherapy, looked up at the Pope with wide eyes. Pope Leo XIV placed his hands gently on the boy's head and prayed silently for several minutes. When he finished, Hiroshi seemed more alert and managed to smile. Arigato gozaimasu, he whispered in Japanese, thanking the Pope. The process continued for over 3 hours. Pope Leo XIV showed no signs of fatigue as he moved from family to family, offering the same personal attention he had given Maria Santos. With some children, he prayed quietly. With others, he spoke words of comfort. Several times, he was moved to tears by the faith and courage he witnessed. As the audience concluded, something remarkable had occurred. While no dramatic healings like Maria's were immediately apparent, many families reported that their children seemed more peaceful, more comfortable, or simply happier than they had been in months. The O'Brien family from Ireland noted that their daughter with cystic fibrosis had breathed more easily during the Pope's prayer. The Petrov family observed that their son with muscular dystrophy had more energy and appetite that evening. But, perhaps most significantly, every family present reported a sense of hope and spiritual healing that transcended their medical circumstances. Parents who had been consumed with despair found peace. Children who had been frightened found courage. In the days following the audience, medical monitoring of the children revealed some improvements in many cases, though nothing as dramatic as Maria's complete healing. Several children showed enhanced immune function. Others experienced reduced pain levels. A few demonstrated temporary improvements in their conditions. Dr. Chen, who had observed the entire audience, published her findings in the Journal of Religious Health. While we documented no cases of instantaneous healing comparable to Maria Santos, she wrote, we observed measurable improvements in stress markers, pain levels, and psychological well-being across the majority of families present. Pope Leo XIV himself drew important lessons from the experience. In a private interview with Vatican Radio, he reflected on what had occurred. I believe God worked a special miracle through Maria Santos to remind us of his power and love, the Pope said. But I also learned that healing comes in many forms. sometimes it is physical, but often it is spiritual or emotional. Every family who came to Rome received some form of healing, even if it wasn't what they initially sought. The global impact of the Maria Santos story and its aftermath continued to resonate for months. Medical schools began incorporating discussions of faith and healing into their curricula. Religious communities experienced renewed interest in prayer and spiritual practices. The Vatican established a new office to investigate and document potential miracles more efficiently. Maria Santos herself became a symbol of hope for families dealing with childhood cancer. The Santos family eventually returned to Brazil, where Maria enrolled in school for the first time in months. Her oncologist, Dr. Rodriguez, continued to monitor her condition and reported that Maria remained completely cancer-free. "She is a living miracle," Dr. Rodriguez said in a follow-up interview 6 months later. Not just because of her healing, but because of the hope her story has brought to families around the world. Pope Leo XIV papacy was permanently transformed by the events that began with a simple act of compassion in St. Peter's Square. He established new programs for families dealing with serious illnesses, increased Vatican support for medical research, and became a global advocate for better healthcare for children. But, perhaps most importantly, the story of Maria Santos reminded the world that in an age of advanced technology and scientific achievement, there remained mysteries that transcended human understanding. Whether one attributed Maria's healing to divine intervention, unexplained medical phenomena, or the power of faith itself, her recovery challenged everyone to consider the limits of what they thought possible. The little girl who had been dying from cancer became a living testament to the power of hope, faith, and compassion. Her story continued to inspire millions of people around the world, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin with the simplest acts of love. As Pope Leo XIV often said in the years that followed, God's greatest miracle is not that He heals our bodies, though sometimes He does. His greatest miracle is that He heals our hearts and gives us the courage to love one another through every circumstance. And, in that truth, perhaps the real miracle of Maria Santos was not just her physical healing, but the healing her story brought to a world in desperate need of hope.